Asserting central dominion, this pawn launch immediately contests the board's heart. Developing the knight towards the center signals intent to contest central space and prepare for rapid pawn advances or piece maneuvers. Developing the knight to a central square like f3 is a solid positional choice, aiming to control key central squares and prepare for kingside castling without immediately committing to a specific pawn structure. Opening the diagonal for the bishop, black prepares for central pawn expansion and solidifies their kingside, anticipating an engagement. Pinning the knight immediately challenges black's central pawn structure and initiates early tactical skirmishes. Challenging the center's pawn structure immediately, black aims to disrupt white's development and seize initiative. Solidifying the center and preparing development, white opts for a quiet maneuver to build a stable pawn structure. Asserting central presence, black immediately challenges white's pawn structure, aiming for dynamic piece play. Securing the knight and preparing for a queenside pawn push cultivates a more robust pawn structure against black's active central play. Developing this knight solidifies the center and prepares for further pawn expansion, a sensible step in contesting the central space. Reinforcing the pawn chain, white solidifies central control and prepares for a potential queenside expansion, subtly limiting black's knight maneuvering options. Challenging the bishop's influence, this pawn advance subtly questions white's setup and prepares to undermine the central control if the bishop retreats to a less active square. Retreating the bishop to h4 maintains pressure on the kingside, specifically eyeing the f6 knight and indirectly supporting a potential e4 push, all while avoiding an immediate pawn exchange that might open lines prematurely. Opening up the center after white's seemingly passive bishop placement is a shrewd decision, potentially relieving pressure and creating dynamic possibilities. This exchange immediately alters the pawn structure, offering black avenues for counterplay down the d-file should it open further. Consider the long-term implications for piece activity. Can your pieces now infiltrate or control crucial squares previously occupied by those pawns? Opening that central diagonal for the queen and bishop is a key objective, and this recapture achieves that while also solidifying the pawn structure. Observe how the black knight on f6 now finds its influence somewhat diminished on the kingside, potentially offering white some breathing room for development. Developing the bishop to its most active diagonal, e7 now prepares to castle and reinforces the d5 pawn, creating a solid central presence. Developing the bishop to d3 solidifies the center's pawn structure and prepares for kingside castling, while simultaneously eyeing the weakened dark squares around black's king should it remain there. Exploring the kingside with the knight, black aims to disrupt white's bishop pair and potentially launch an attack, though it does concede some central influence and creates a slightly unusual knight outpost. Exchanging the bishop eliminates black's knight from the queenside's crucial attacking square and simplifies the position, a welcome development for white given the pawn structure and open d-file potential. Reclaiming the pawn immediately consolidates black's central presence and avoids any lingering weaknesses, effectively preparing for the imminent development of the queenside pieces with a clear vision for active play. Securing the king's safety is paramount, and this castling move elegantly tucks the monarch away while simultaneously activating the rook for potential central involvement. Challenging the bishop's reign, nf4 aggressively repositions the knight to a central outpost, eyeing weak squares and preparing for potential tactical fireworks around the white king's defenses. Repositioning the bishop to c2 addresses the immediate pressure from the knight on f4 and clears the diagonal for the queen, simultaneously preparing to castle queenside if the situation demands, while subtly reinforcing control over the c-file. Embracing the central tension, black redirects the queen to a more active diagonal, eyeing potential weaknesses around white's king and preparing to support a queenside pawn push. Refocusing the rook to the center aims to increase pressure along the e-file, preparing for potential piece exchanges or a pawn push forward if black isn't careful about developing their pieces further. Safeguarding the monarch is paramount. Castling initiates crucial defensive measures, preparing the king for potential early threats and integrating it into the army's protective structure. Strategically boxing in black's knight, white initiates a subtle pawn lever to gain queenside space and potentially open the g-file for a future attack. Dismantling the centralized knight creates a more harmonious pawn structure, albeit momentarily, opening a diagonal for your bishop and preparing to contest the center more actively. Centering the queen on e2 unlocks the d1h5 diagonal, eyeing potential weaknesses around black's kingside, and preparing for a pawn storm on the kingside or a central pawn advance, while simultaneously supporting the knight on f3. Black aims to improve the dark-squared bishop's scope by fianchettoing it to b7, a solid positional maneuver that also seeks to prepare for potential queenside expansion. Prying open that kingside becomes a potent threat. White aims to generate attacking chances by exploiting the weakened pawn structure after the pawn push. Black solidifies the e-file occupation, preparing to potentially contest control with white's rook and untangle the knight from its somewhat passive g6 perch, aiming for a more active role either on f4 or directly challenging white's e3 pawn. Injecting knight to the center now offers significant pressure, potentially disrupting black's pawn structure and creating outposts for other pieces. An immediate simplification that breaks white's centralized knight and frees black's bishop, creating imbalances. This capture strategically targets the pawn structure, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside after the eventual exchange. The sacrifice of a pawn for piece activity is evident here, seeking compensation in dynamic play and open lines. Black bravely ventures into a position that might appear risky, but it's a calculated risk to disrupt white's harmonious setup. A bold decision that seeks to inject tactical complexity into a rather quiet positional game, aiming for initiative. Unlocking the diagonal for your queen and creating an outpost for the knight on f4, this capture decisively asserts central control and opens avenues for future piece activity. Reshuffling the queen, black prioritizes safety for the monarch, but subtly surrenders the crucial central outpost to white's knight, potentially leading to a cramped position if white can establish a strong presence on d5. Refocusing the knight to the central battlefield after the queen exchange subtly prepares for kingside pressure, potentially clearing the way for a future f4 push to seize more space and restrict black's minor pieces. Launching a queenside expansion, black prepares to contest the open c-file, aiming to liberate their positional limitations and potentially create a passed pawn. A strategic repositioning unfolds, aiming to centralize the knight and potentially exploit the now weakened kingside pawn structure after black's recent pawn advances. This knight may soon contest squares like f5 or g6, creating immediate pressure. Black solidifies the queenside pawn structure and prepares to develop the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to contest the central tension and potentially support an eventual e5 pawn push. The bishop repositions to d3, re-establishing diagonal influence and preparing for potential future pawn pushes like f4, aiming to gain more central space and launch an attack against black's kingside. A subtle repositioning begins, aiming to solidify the queenside and potentially prepare for future pawn advances like b5. Understanding the subtle shifts in piece placement is crucial here. Black's knight, having explored the central squares and been forced back, now seeks a more harmonious role on the queenside. The Rab8 initiative is not overtly aggressive, but speaks volumes about a long-term plan to gain queenside space and exert pressure. This also implicitly frees up the b-file for potential rook activity, creating latent threats. It's a move that whispers of future positional struggles, patiently building foundations for a more dynamic middle game. Seeking to solidify queen's pawn control and prevent black's thematic upon push, this tempo-gaining thrust asserts space on the queenside, aiming to restrict black's maneuvering options. Reorganizing the knights is the primary objective here, bringing the knight back from the edge of the board to a more active central square. This maneuver aims to bolster the kingside pawn structure and prepare for potential counterplay in the center. Unleashing a bold pawn thrust, white dramatically stakes a claim in the center, aiming to disrupt black's nascent queenside play and potentially open lines towards the enemy king. This aggressive maneuver signals a shift in White's strategy, moving from a more restrained build-up to actively contesting the central territory and creating imbalances. The pawn on f4, while creating potential weaknesses on the dark squares, also serves as a powerful attacking spearhead. Black reinforces the c-file, preparing to contest it and potentially exploit the d-pawn's isolated position. This move signals an intent to become more active on the queen side, shifting focus away from the center where White currently enjoys some space. The knight on f8 is awkwardly placed, and bringing the rook into play on an open file is a sensible step towards activating Black's forces. It also subtly aims to limit White's pawn push on the king side by creating counterplay. Securing the monarch's sanctuary amidst the emerging battlefield, this maneuver redirects attention from the immediate pawn thrust to the king's safety, a crucial preemptive strike against any potential central infiltration or flank harassment. A subtle repositioning of the queen, aiming to connect the rooks and prepare for potential action on the queen side, or simply to find a more active square where it can support future pawn pushes like c5 or e5. This maneuver demonstrates Black's intention to untangle their pieces, perhaps anticipating an imminent pawn storm or looking to create counterplay by challenging White's central control. The queen embarks on a journey, seeking a safer haven while simultaneously eyeing opportunities to support a kingside initiative or bolster the defense of key pawns. Shifting the queen to e8 is a prudent step, allowing for better coordination with the rooks and potentially freeing up the f6 square for a knight should the opportunity arise. A tactical geometric adjustment, the queen vacates the e-file, opening it for the rook and possibly hinting at a future regrouping to launch an attack or fortify their position. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, White immediately challenges Black's pawn structure and aims to pry open lines for an assault, potentially targeting the isolated f6 knight. Shifting the knight to the kingside creates a complex interplay of defensive and offensive aspirations, aiming to solidify the pawn structure while potentially probing for weaknesses in White's advanced pawn front. The queen recenters to prepare for a potential pawn push on the kingside, eyeing the g4 square as a launching pad to destabilize Black's pawn structure. Black, after a period of jockeying for position, now consolidates their queen's presence on the 7th rank, a seemingly passive repositioning that prepares for potential central pawn pushes or the exploration of open files should White overcommit. Unleashing a bold pawn thrust, White aims to disrupt Black's comfortable space and prepare a kingside siege, though it does create a potential outpost for Black's knights on g6. The knight retreats to its starting square, a passive maneuver that concedes crucial tempo and initiative, allowing White's pawn storm on the kingside to gain unstoppable momentum. Bringing the rook over to the g-file suggests a desire to exploit the open file, potentially creating threats against Black's king or reinforcing a kingside pawn advance. The repositioning of the rook to g1 might be the prelude to a tactical sequence, aiming to create a battery with the queen or prepare for a pawn storm that could crack open the kingside. This rook maneuver on g1 signals a shift in White's focus towards the kingside, hinting at an eventual attack or a defensive reinforcement against Black's potential counterplay in that sector. By placing the rook on g1, White is setting the stage for potential piece activity along the g-file, aiming to disrupt Black's defensive structure and seize the initiative. This redeployment of the rook to g1 can be interpreted as White preparing for an aggressive pawn push on the kingside, using the rook to support the advance and open lines towards Black's monarch. Unleashing the pawn storm on the kingside is a bold counter to White's territorial ambitions, aiming to disrupt the king's safety by forcing pawn exchanges and opening crucial lines for Black's pieces. Reactivating the rook on the e-file, this is about establishing a presence and potentially creating attacking avenues. With the e-pawn now advanced and the central pawn structure somewhat fluid, bringing a rook into the open e-file offers possibilities for both offensive pressure against Black's king and defensive support should Black's pieces penetrate. It's a subtle positional maneuver, aiming to coordinate pieces more effectively and prepare for potential breakthroughs later in the game. This redeployment also clears the way for the other rook, creating options for doubled rooks on crucial files or flanking maneuvers. Black boldly challenges white's queenside structure, aiming to exploit the open lines that might emerge. This capture isn't just about material. It's a dynamic attempt to unravel white's coordinated pieces and potentially create weaknesses around the enemy king. Shifting the queen to this square initiates a subtle yet potent plan to exploit the now vulnerable kingside by opening lines for the rooks and potentially creating mating threats. Black strategically repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to contest the open c-file and potentially support a queenside pawn advance later. Exploiting the pinned knight, this capture immediately opens lines towards black's king, aiming to dismantle its defenses by removing a key pawn shield. Reclaiming the queen's central presence and preparing to contest the open f-file offers a dynamic counter to white's kingside pawn advances. Activating the rook to the 5th rank now allows white to exert pressure on the queenside pawn structure and potentially create an outpost for the knight on d4, while also offering a conduit for central infiltration should the opportunity arise. Rethinking the pressure on the kingside, black shifts the queen to a less exposed square, preparing for potential pawn advances or simply seeking a more robust defensive posture. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside now seeks to shatter black's defensive shell, hoping to pry open lines for the rooks and queen into a vulnerable monarch. Exposing the king's sanctuary with that aggressive raid can be a double-edged sword, potentially unraveling the entire defensive structure or creating decisive attacking avenues. The monarch abandons the safety of his castled position, exposing himself to potential counterplay along the g-file. Sacrificing the pawn opens a dangerous diagonal for your king. Unleashing a pawn storm with this capture initiates a dramatic shift, directly challenging the opposing queen and opening lines that were previously held shut. It's a bold declaration, prioritizing dynamic piece play and the potential for a swift assault on the black king's sanctuary, even if it means leaving some positional structural elements compromised for the moment. The queen's redeployment here seeks to activate the monarch from its exposed position and prepare for a more active defense of the kingside. Unlocking the f-file for your rooks offers a dynamic avenue for offense, putting pressure on black's potentially exposed king. Re-establishing contact on the central files after that pawn sacrifice offers a critical opportunity to regroup and prepare for an assault on white's weakened kingside. Pushing the g-pawn creates immediate threats on the kingside, potentially opening lines for your pieces and exploiting the backwardness of black's kingside pawn structure, forcing them to commit defensively and potentially revealing weaknesses. Unleashing the rook to c4 dynamically targets the weakened c3 pawn and offers a tantalizing exchange, disrupting white's pawn chain and potentially opening lines for black's remaining pieces. Unleashing the rook on the 7th rank, a bold repositioning aimed at creating mating nets and exploiting the open files, forcing black's king into a perilous situation amidst the chaotic pawn structure. Sacrificing the rook on d4 severs white's central pawn structure, aiming to unleash black's queenside initiative and potentially trap the white king. Sacrificing the rook here forces a black queen retreat, thereby solidifying white's control over the crucial g-file and opening avenues for the king to escape further danger from the encroaching black forces.